Thank you, Mr. Barr. I think what we have left on our side is Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, Blackburn, and Tillis, and Senator Booker, Harris. Anybody else? I think that's it. And round one. So, Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barr, do you know of any instance in which anybody has tried to interfere in Mr. Mueller's investigation?
No, I mean, I'm not in the Department of Justice, and I have no, I'm not privy to that information, but I don't know of any.
I understand you know Mr. Mueller, do you?
Yes, I do.
Is he big enough to take care of himself?
He's a Marine.
Yeah. If someone had tried to interfere with his investigation, based on your knowledge of Mr. Mueller, would he have something to say about it, including but not limited to in a court of law?
Yes, Senator.
I want to try to cut through some of the innuendo here. Did President Trump instruct or ask you, once you become Attorney General, to fire Mr. Mueller?
Absolutely not.
Did he ask you to interfere in Mr. Mueller's investigation?
Absolutely not.
Has anybody in the White House made that suggestion to you?
Absolutely not.
Has anybody in the Western Hemisphere made that suggestion to you?
Absolutely not.
Okay. I want to associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Blumenthal about the FBI being the premier law enforcement agency in the history of the world, in my opinion, in the high esteem in which we all hold the Department of Justice. But I have a question for you. This counterintelligence investigation that was started by FBI and Justice allegedly about President Trump, how did the New York Times get that information?
I don't know, Senator.
Well, didn't it have to come from the FBI or the Department of Justice?
I just can't say. I don't know how they got it, and I don't know whether that's an accurate report.
Right. What do you intend to do about the leaks coming out of the FBI and the Department of Justice?
The problem of leaks is a difficult one to address. I think the first thing is to make it clear that there's an expectation that there are no leaks, and punish people through internal discipline if there are leaks. Also, keep exercise more compartmentalization and discipline, and make the institutions that are responsible, if you're talking about the FBI, that their leadership is taking aggressive action to stop the leaks.
Okay. You've had some experience with the enforcement of our immigration laws. Is that correct?
That's right, Senator.
Do you believe it is possible to secure a 1,900-mile border without, in part at least, using barriers?
No, I don't think it's possible.
Okay.
When I was Attorney General, we had the INS as part of the department, and I remember another part of my kibitzing was trying to persuade George W. Bush's administration not to break that out. But in those days, I had some studies done, and I was trying within the budget to put as much as we could on barriers as we could.
Okay. Do you believe that ICE should be abolished, as some of my colleagues do?
Certainly not.
Okay. You're Roman Catholic, are you not?
Yes, I am.
Do you think that disqualifies you from serving in the United States government?
I don't think so, no.
Okay. Why is that?
Why doesn't it disqualify me?
Some of my colleagues think it might.
Because you render under Caesar that which is Caesar's, and unto God that which is God. And I believe in the separation of church and state. And if there was something that was against my conscience, I wouldn't impose it on others. I would resign my office.
Yeah. I think it's called freedom of religion.
Yes.
As I recall.
That's right.
If the federal government threatens to withhold federal money from a university, if that university doesn't investigate, prosecute, punish sexual assault in a way prescribed by the federal government, does that make the state university a state actor, or the university a state actor?
It may. I would have to look at the cases. I'm not up to speed on those, but I would think so.
Well, if the federal government says to a university, look, if you do not prosecute, investigate, punish allegations of sexual assault in a way that that the federal government says you must, otherwise we're going to take away your federal money. Does the accused in one of those sexual assault allegations still have the protection of the Bill of Rights?
I would hope so.
Should he or her?
I'd have to look and see exactly the state actor law right now. But what you're getting at is, the rules that were forced on universities in handling sexual harassment cases.
Right.
That I felt essentially did away with due process.
Yes.
And I think the victim, as a father of 3 daughters, I take very seriously any question of sexual harassment. It's a serious problem, and the word of a victim has to be taken very seriously, and it has to be pursued. But we can't do it at the expense of the Bill of Rights, or basic fairness and due process.
Both the accused and the accuser deserve due process, do they not?
That's right.
Okay. Tell me what the legal basis is for a universal injunction.
I think universal injunctions are have no. Well, let me say that they are a recent vintage. They really started arising in the '60s, and I think that they have lost sight of a limitation on the judicial power of the United States, which is case or controversy.
It's all based on the D.C. Circuit case, the Wirtz case. Is that right?
I forgot the name of the case, but I think the D.C. Circuit case was the first one. I think that was in the '60s, and people have lost sight of the fact that it's really a question of who gets the relief in a case. And under the case or controversy, it should be limited to the parties. And when earlier you could have a court in one jurisdiction decide it, and that would be the rule in that jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. But that didn't debar the government from continuing its policies elsewhere, and eventually you'd get differences, and they would work their way up to the Supreme Court. I think that I'd like to see these universal injunctions challenged.
Well, I don't know how many federal district court judges we have. Let's say 650. As I understand it, one can enjoin a congressional statute nationwide, even if the other 624 judges disagree.
That's right.
All right.
And not just a statute, Senator. I think what's different, what we're seeing is the willingness of courts to set aside, even the kinds of exercises of national security power that, 20 years ago would have been unimaginable for a court to challenge. And yet a district court judge somewhere can enjoin some action that has a bearing on the safety of the nation. And then the judicial process can take years and years to get that up to the Supreme Court.
I've just got a few seconds left. As I understand your testimony, General, Mr. Mueller will write a report, submit it to you as Attorney General, and then you will write a report based on that report and release your report. Is that right?
That's essentially it, but I wouldn't assume, you know, it could easily be that the report is communicated to the department before, assuming I was confirmed. That could be a month away.
Well, let me tell you what I'm getting at. I've got 6 seconds. Now 4. The American people deserve to know what the Department of Justice has concluded. And they're smart enough to figure it out. I've said this before. The American people don't read Aristotle every day. They're too busy earning a living. But if you give them the facts, they'll figure it out, and they'll draw their own conclusions. Doesn't matter who spins them. They'll figure it out for themselves. And I would strongly encourage you to put this all to rest, to make a report, a final report, public, to let everybody draw their own conclusions so we can move on. If somebody did something wrong, they should be punished. But if they didn't, let's stop the innuendo and the rumors and the leaking, and let's move on.
I agree, Senator. And let me say, you know, earlier I misspoke because the acting Attorney General is Matt Whitaker, and I referred to Rod as the acting Attorney General. But in fact, the report would go to Matt Whitaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to remark, Mr. Barr, that your family is showing a prodigious level of patience and indefatigable endurance, and that should be marked for the record. You're a very lucky man. You know that about 30-plus states have legalized medical marijuana or adult use. You're aware of that, correct?
Yes.
In 2018, Attorney General Jeff Sessions rescinded the Cole Memorandum, which provided guidance to U.S. attorneys that the federal marijuana prohibition should not be enforced in states that have legalized marijuana in one way or the other. Do you believe it was the right decision to rescind the Cole Memorandum?
My approach to this would be not to upset settled expectations and the reliance interests that have arisen as a result of the Cole Memoranda, and investments have been made, and so there have been reliance on it. So I don't think it's appropriate to upset those interests. However, I think the current situation is untenable and really has to be addressed. It's almost like a backdoor nullification of federal law. To me, it's a binary choice. Either we have a federal law that applies to everybody.
And so I'm sorry to interrupt you, sir, but how would you address that? Well, do you think it's appropriate to use federal resources to target, marijuana businesses that are in compliance with state laws?
No, I said that. Yeah. That's what I said. I'm not going to go after companies that have relied on the Cole Memoranda. However, we either should have a federal law that prohibits marijuana everywhere, which I would support myself, because I think it's a mistake to back off on marijuana. However, if we want a federal approach, if we want states to have their own laws, then let's get there, and let's get there the right way.
And if you don't mind, I'm going to just move on. But it's good to hear at least the first part of what you said. During your previous tenure as Attorney General, you literally wrote the book on mass incarceration, or at least wrote this report, The Case for More Incarceration. You argue that we as a nation were, quote, incarcerating too few criminals.
In those days.
And that the solution was more incarceration for more people.
Excuse me.
Please, sir.
For chronic violent offenders and gun offenders.
Well, I mean that's the challenge, sir. And you argued against the bipartisan legislation in 2015 quite strenuously.
I did.
But that's not the nature of incarceration in this country. In fiscal year 2016, only 7.7% of the federal prison population was convicted of violent crimes. Overwhelmingly, what was initiated in those times that led to an 800% increase in the federal prison population, overwhelmingly, that was nonviolent drug offenders. Right now, our federal prison population is overwhelmingly nonviolent. 47.5% of the federal prison population are incarcerated for drug offenses. And I guess hearing your arguments then and hearing your arguments against the bipartisan legislation that we brought out of the committee in 2016.
But Senator, I think that's wrong, what you just said, okay? I think when you have violent gangs in the city, killing people, murder and so forth and so on, Sometimes the most readily provable charge is their drug trafficking offenses, rather than proving culpability of the whole gang for murder. So you can take out a gang on drug offenses, and you could be taking out a lot of violent offenders. Do you think that the murders in Chicago are they're related to gangs,
and
including
again,
gangs involved in?
And sir, and again, and we can get into the data if you'd like, and I'd like to get some more pointed questioning. But this is the sort of these are sort of the tropes that make people believe that in inner cities we should have such profound incarceration rates. And I'd like to ask you specifically about that data, because I think it's language like that makes me kind of concerned and worried. You said you hadn't reviewed, you said earlier in your testimony you hadn't reviewed criminal justice data about this actual issue of incarceration versus non-incarceration. I just want to know, will you commit to commissioning a study on just the concerns that we're talking about right now about the efficacy of reducing mass incarceration and publish those results? Would you be willing to do such a study yourself?
Well, no, as I understand it, I've been told that there's a lot of data to support the First Step Act.
Yeah, and that First Step Act goes directly towards addressing a lot of the problems we've had in mass incarceration. And so if you're saying that it is necessary to deal with violence in communities by over-incarcerating, here's a bipartisan group of senators that's working towards reducing mass incarceration. And that's why I think it's very important, which I appreciate you saying you didn't know because you hadn't reviewed the data. I think it's very important that you review the data and understand the implications for the language that you're using, which brings up this language of race, which is often not said explicitly, but when you talk about Chicago in the way you just did, it brings up racial fears or racial concerns. And you stated that if a black and a white, this is quoting you directly, are charged with the same offense, generally they will get the same treatment in the system and ultimately the same penalty. You previously quoted, and I quote you again, there's no statistical evidence that there of racism in the criminal justice system. Do you still believe that?
No, what I said was that I think that's taken out of a broader quote, which is the whole criminal justice system involves both federal but also state, local justice systems. And I said there's no doubt that there are places where there is racism still in the system. But I said overall, I thought that as a system, it's working, it's not predicated on.
So can I press you on that? Overall, the system treats blacks and whites fairly. From my own experience, I've lived in affluent communities, I've gone to the college campuses of you. There are certain drug laws applied there that's very in which I live, but let's talk stats, let's not talk our personal experiences. And so I've sat with many of my colleagues and many conservatives who readily admit what the data shows. And so I have a whole bunch of reports which I'll enter into the record from nonpartisan, bipartisan groups, even conservative leaders talking about the rife nature of racial bias within the system. For example, the federal government's own data, the U.S. Sentencing Commission's research shows that federal prosecutors are more likely to charge blacks with offenses that carry harsh mandatory minimum sentences than similarly situated for whites. The federal government's own data shows that black defendants were subject to 3-strike sentencing enhancements at a statistically significantly higher rate, which added, on average, over 10 years to their sentences. And so with numerous researchers having found stunning racial disparities rife throughout our system and in the federal system, which you will be the chief law enforcement officer of, and primarily for overwhelmingly for drug laws. For example, I don't know if you're aware or not of the Brookings study that found that blacks are 3.6 times more likely to be arrested for selling drugs, despite the fact that whites are actually more likely to sell drugs in the United States of America, and blacks are 2.5 times more likely to be arrested for possession of drugs when there is no difference racially in America for the usage and possession of drugs in the United States. I don't know if are you familiar with the Brookings study?
No, I'm not.
Okay, so just a follow-up, will you commit to commissioning a study examining racial disparities and disparate impacts of the policies that you talked about that led to mass incarceration, the policies that you defended when you criticized the bipartisan 2015 sentencing reform legislation? Will you commit to, at least as the most important law enforcement officer in the land, to studying those well-documented racial disparities and the impacts it has?
Of course I'll commit to studying that, and I'll have the Bureau of Justice Statistics pull together everything they have, and if there's something lacking, I'll get that, and I'm interested in the state experience. But when I looked at this, I think 1992 was a different time, Senator. The crime rate had quintupled over the preceding 30 years, and it peaked in 1992. And it's been coming down since 1992.
And sir, I just want to tell you, I was a young black guy in 1990s. I was a 20-something-year-old and experienced a dramatically different justice system in the treatment that I received. Okay. And the data of racial disparities and what it's done to black communities, because you literally said this about black communities, and I know that your heart was in the right place. You said that, hey, I want to help black communities. This is what you're saying. The benefits of incarceration would be enjoyed disproportionately by black Americans living in inner cities. You also said that, quote, a failure to incarcerate hurts black Americans most.
And I'll tell you what's...
And I just want to ask you a yes or no question, because I have seconds left. Do you believe now, 30, 40 years of mass incarceration, targeted disproportionately towards African Americans, harsher sentences, disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system, with the American Bar Association talking about once you've been incarcerated for even a low-level drug crime, there are 40,000 collateral consequences that impact your life. Jobs, Pell Grants, loans from banks. Do you think, just yes or no, that this system of mass incarceration has disproportionately benefited African American communities? Yes or no, sir?
I think the reduction in crime has since 1992, but I think that the heavy drug penalties, especially on crack and other things, have harmed the black community. The incarceration rates have harmed the black community.
And I would just conclude to my chairman and partner, thank you, sir, on this, because I'm really grateful for this bipartisan group, the Heritage Foundation. I've spoken at the AEI conference, just found such great partnership, but I worry about the highest law enforcement officer in the land and some of the language I still hear you using that goes against the data, and that you're going to be expected to oversee a justice system that you and I both know needs the faith and confidence of communities that has dramatically lost that confidence because of implicit racial bias. And the DOJ, and I'll give you a chance to respond, the DOJ itself has said, mandated implicit racial bias training, and I hope that's something that you will agree to do. But this is the thing I'll conclude on, is that we live on a planet Earth where you can tell the most about a nation by who they incarcerate. In Turkey, they incarcerate journalists. Thank God we don't do that here, even though they've been called the enemy of the people. In Russia, they incarcerate political opponents. I'm glad we don't do that, even though with chance of lock her up. But you go into the American criminal prisons, sir, and you see the most vulnerable people. You see over-stigmatized mentally ill people clogging our system. You see over-stigmatized addicted people clogging our system. You see a system where, as Brian Stevenson says, it treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. And you see disproportionately, overwhelmingly for drug crimes, African Americans and Latinos being incarcerated. The importance of your job, and I'll ask you this last question, because you haven't met with me yet, you've given that courtesy to others. Would you please meet with me in my office so you and I can have a heart-to-heart on the urgency, the cancer on the soul of our country's criminal justice system is the disproportionate impact of that system on those vulnerable communities, including women, over 80% of whom the women we incarcerate are survivors of sexual trauma. Can you and I sit down and have a longer conversation than these 10 minutes will allow on this issue?
I'd very much welcome that, Senator. You know, my experience back in 1992, when sort of blood was running on the streets all over the United States, my ideas were actually first formed when I went to Trenton. And the African-American community there essentially surrounded me and was saying, look, we're in our golden years. We're trying to enjoy our golden years, and we can't even go outside our house. We have bars on our house and so forth. Please, these gangs are running roughshod. So I developed this idea called weed and seed. And my attitude was, look, let's stop arguing past each other on let's attack root causes and let's get tough on crime. And I felt that for programs to work, like after-school programs and so forth, for all this, you know, for housing projects to be safe, we needed strong enforcement in those communities, and we needed those other programs to be brought to bear community by community. And it had to be done with the leadership of the community. And that was this idea of the partnership. And it caught on. It was very popular. And in fact, it was continued by a lot of the U.S. attorneys in the Clinton administration after the Bush administration was out. And it is actually, under a number of different names, has continued. So I'm very conscious of the issues you raise, but my goal is to provide and my motivation was to provide safety in these neighborhoods for the people trying to raise their children and for the older people and so forth. And I think the neighborhoods are, you know, the crime rate has gone down. I make a distinction between the way we treat these chronic violent offenders and the drug penalties. The drug penalties, as I said, very high and draconian, and in some cases that might have been necessary, but I supported revisiting the penalty structure.
And sir, I'm the only United States senator that lives in an inner city, low-income community. I've had shootings in my neighborhood. A young man killed last year on my block with an assault weapon. I know this urgent need for safety and security, and I'm not saying I'm necessarily going to vote for you one way or the other, but I believe your intentions are well, but I think that some of the things you've said in the past lead me to believe that your policies might be misguided. In the way that Mike Lee and Cornyn and Graham and Grassley have been incredible partners in changing the American reality, I hope that you can be that kind of partner too, and I hope that you and I can have a good heart-to-heart conversation, trusting that we both want the same end for all communities, safety and security, but a justice system that is fair to all American citizens.
I'd welcome that.
Thank you, sir.
Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we appreciate your time today, Mr. Barr, and that of your family. I told Liam that Grandpa ought to give him whatever he wants to eat for dinner tonight. He has behaved very well and done a great job. Going back to something that Senator Kennedy mentioned on leaks, and you said you would address that by compartmentalization. Talk for just a little bit about your vision for the Department of Justice as you look at implementing first steps, addressing violent crime, dealing with the opioids, dealing with the online sex trafficking, the antitrust issues, the Mueller investigation, all the things we've talked about. How do you intend to lead that department that is very different from the DOJ that you led previously?
In some ways it's different, in some ways it's not so different, but my basic approach to things is to get good lieutenants, good subordinates who are running different parts of the agenda, and give them, their marching orders and watch them perform and get involved to the extent I can to make sure that we're pushing the priorities things ahead. One of the interesting things about the Department of Justice, it's a little different than many agencies, is one of our first priority has to be to enforce all the law. It's not like we can just come into work and say, well, we're going to just pay attention to this, so we're not going to enforce all these other laws. We have to cover the waterfront. That's number one. But beyond that, what I tried to do last time and what I would try to do if you confirm me this time would be, to make sure that even though we're enforcing things across the board, we have a understood set of priorities and we put the effort behind those priorities. And we define clearly what we're trying to achieve. So, for example, in the area of civil rights, when I was Attorney General last time, and I had discussed this with Senator Kennedy, I said, we're not doing enough on housing discrimination. Housing is very important. It determines where you go to school and all other, the safety and so forth. And I set up a program. We hired testers and stuff like that, and we had a very clear goal and priority for that, and we launched it. And that's what I plan to bring in area after area, defining what we're trying to accomplish and give the people the tools to get it done and give them the direction and motivation to get it done.
You've mentioned the Mueller investigation, your relationship with Mr. Mueller. having him finish the investigation. If we were to ask him about you, do you think his assessment would be that you are a fair and impartial leader that he can trust, that we can trust to lead the DOJ?
I hope he would say that, but I'm not going to put words in his mouth.
Yeah. We talked about technology and my interest in that area, and you've had Mr. Lee and Mr. Hawley have also talked about antitrust and some of the enforcement there. Big tech and Silicon Valley and the power that is harbored there, they are gobbling up a lot of their competitors. You've got Facebook and Google that are claiming to only be platforms for their users, but they are also getting into the content business. And that is why Facebook bought Instagram and WhatsApp, and Google bought YouTube and DeepMind for AI technology. So their tentacles are spreading, and they are moving away from a platform into that content, into artificial intelligence. And their market dominance is causing some problems. And as we discuss, these companies are violating users' privacy. They are recklessly sharing their users' personal data with third parties. This is done without explicit permission. We can't let these companies collude to drive out competitors or to ignore vital data privacy protections. And big tech operated really without regard to the law. And you and I talked a little bit about one of the edge provider CEOs who last spring, when he came before a House committee, he was also here before this committee, there was even reference to how I discussed how he subjectively manipulated, or asked if he subjectively manipulated algorithms, and how there was concern that some of these platforms referencing a statement he had made function more like a government than a platform or an information service. So how do you intend to begin this conversation and begin this work addressing the antitrust provisions with big tech?
Yes, you know, as I mentioned, I'm interested in these issues and would like to have them fully ventilated at the department with the antitrust division and also with, you know, outside experts, so I can have a better understanding. I do want to say, however, that I'm going to be recusing myself from AT&T because
Time Warner, yeah.
Yeah, because now Time Warner is part of AT&T, right. And I was told that under the rules that will carry over to AT&T. So until I talk to the ethics advisors of the department, I don't want to get too far ahead of my skis and sort of talking about the tech area. But as a general policy matter, I want to get into this area because I think it's on a lot of people's minds and how the law relates to these you know, to these developments that we see with these large companies. And I don't mean to cast aspersions on any particular company or executive.
Well, and I think for many of us, if you're looking at a merger and they cannot prove the efficiencies and they cannot prove that there will be increased competition, then it does raise some questions as to how those would be evaluated. And let me go to one other issue that is developing on this privacy front. It is a data privacy problem that I don't think a lot of people realize, and it is the embedding of hardware and then the geolocation. And sometimes that information is sold. Now, it folds into the encryption issue because law enforcement has a very difficult time getting the information from devices and from the services on encryption. But we are now aware that many times bounty hunters will be paid a few $100s, and then they can go in and find the location of that phone. And some of these Android operating systems are specific enough that they do the barometric pressure readings, and they can tell you exactly where in a building that this phone is located. So I would hope that you are going to look at the legal procedures that surround this kind of data and this kind of tracking and the privacy provisions that are going to pertain to consumers as they use these devices.
Yes.
Good, thank you. Let me move on. Senator Ernst talked a little bit about the online sex trafficking. In Tennessee, we have followed this issue so closely because our TBI carried out an operation where they apprehended 22 traffickers. 22 men were arrested for sex trafficking, and much of that work and the work I've done in the House on the online sex trafficking, working to shut down Backpage.com and to keep our children and keep women safe from these online traffickers. And, you know, we were so pleased that last April, the Justice Department seized Backpage and charged 7 defendants for facilitating prostitution and sex trafficking crimes. And what we know is that when you shut down a site like Backpage, the big one, then you have a lot of small sites that proliferate. And we know that it is going to really take a lot of effort to arrest this situation so that you're not constantly playing whack-a-mole with these. So I would hope that you will be committed to putting an end to this kind of violence and online trafficking.
Yes, and I know how focused you are on it and the leadership you've provided over the years on it. I don't know that much about the problem and also about what resources are currently being devoted to it in the department, but I would like to come by and talk to you further about it once I get exposed to it, if I'm confirmed. Okay.
Thank you. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Barr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations. And to you, congratulations on your nomination, and thank you for your lifetime of dedication to public service.
Thank you.
In response to a question that Senator Ernst asked, you mentioned that we need barriers across the border to deal with drug trafficking. Are you advocating a wall?
Well, I think I'm advocating a system, a barrier system. In some places, and I'd have to find out more about the situation since I last visited the border.
From what you know, or do you believe that a wall would address the concern that you have about drug trafficking?
Well, a wall certainly would, but in some places it may not be necessary to have, you know, what most people imagine as a wall.
Are you aware that most of the drugs coming into the United States, in particular through Mexico, are entering through ports of entry?
Yes, but they also come elsewhere, and so do illegal immigrants cross the border. And
but
basically,
in particular on the subject of drug trafficking, are you aware that most of the drugs that are trafficked into the United States enter through points of entry?
yes.
Have you recently or ever visited a point of entry, a port of entry?
Not
the United States?
Not recently.
When
I
was
used
the
to
last
spend
time?
a lot of time, well, when I was Attorney General,
So a couple decades ago.
almost 30 years.
Okay. I'd urge you to visit again if and when you are confirmed. I think you'll see that a lot has changed over the years. Given status quo on marijuana and the fact that 10 states, including the District of Columbia, have legalized marijuana, and given that the status quo is what it is, and as you rightly described, we have federal laws and then there are various states that have different laws. If confirmed, are you intending to use the limited federal resources at your disposal to enforce federal marijuana laws in the states that have legalized marijuana?
No, I thought I answered that by saying that you know, to the extent people are complying with with the state laws, you know, in distribution and production and so forth. We're not going to go after that.
Okay.
But I do feel we can't stay in the current situation because, I mean, if you can imagine any kind of situation, can an existing administration and an attorney general start cutting deals with states to say, well, we're not going to apply the federal law, you know, some gun law or some other thing, and say, well, we're not going to apply it in your state.
I appreciate your point, but specifically, and I appreciate you answering the question, you do not intend to use the limited federal resources at your disposal to enforce federal marijuana laws in those states or in the District of Columbia that have legalized marijuana.
That's right, but I think the Congress of the United States, it's incumbent on the Congress to regularize, you know, make a decision as to whether we're going to have a federal system or whether it's going to be, you know, a central federal law, because this is breeding disrespect for the federal law.
I agree with you. I believe Congress should act. I agree. Earlier today, Senator Leahy asked whether you would follow the recommendation of career Department of Justice ethics officials on whether you should recuse yourself from the Mueller investigation. You said, quote, I will seek the advice of the career ethics personnel, but under the regulations, I make the decisions as the head of the agency as to my own recusal. You also said to Senator Klobuchar that you do not want to, quote, abdicate your duty since recusal decision would be yours. So my question is, would it be appropriate to go against the advice of career ethics officials that have recommended recusal? And can you give an example of under what situation or scenario you would go against their recommendation that you recuse yourself?
Well, there are different kinds of recusals. Some are mandated, for example, if you have a financial interest, but there are others that are judgment calls. And
let's imagine it's a judgment call, and the judgment by the career ethics officials in the agency are that you recuse yourself. Under what scenario would you not follow their recommendation?
If I disagreed with it.
And what would the basis of that disagreement be?
I came to a different judgment.
On what basis?
The facts.
Such as?
Such as whatever facts are relevant to the recusal.
What do you imagine the facts would be that are relevant to the recusal?
They could be innumerable. I mean, there are a lot of, you know, for example, there's a rule of necessity, like who else would be handling it. It could be. Do
you believe that would be a concern in this situation if you are, if the recommendation is that you recuse yourself from the Mueller investigation? Do you believe that would be a concern, that there'd be no one left to do the job?
I'm just saying, well, in some contexts, there very well might be because of. You know, who's confirmed for what and who's in what position. But apart from that, it's a judgment call, and the Attorney General is the person who makes the judgment, and that's what the job entails.
As a general matter, that's true, but specifically on this issue, under what scenario would you imagine that you would not follow the recommendation of the career ethics officials in the Department of Justice to recuse yourself from the Mueller investigation?
If I disagreed with them.
Okay. We'll move on. Senator Feinstein previously asked you whether you'd put your June 2018 memo, whether you put together that memo based on non-public information. Your response was that you, quote, did not rely on confidential information. Are you creating a distinction between non-public information and confidential information?
No.
Okay. In response to a question from Senator Durbin about harsh sentencing laws, you stated in response to the crack epidemic that community leaders, back when you were Attorney General previously, asked for these types of sentencing laws. Now, my understanding is that many of these community leaders at that time, and I was a young prosecutor during those days, knew and said even then that the crack epidemic was a public health crisis. And that was really the chorus coming from community leaders, not that they wanted drug-addicted people to be locked up. And similarly, now we can find that in most of the communities afflicted by the opioid crisis, they are similarly, these community leaders, asking that it be addressed for the public health crisis that it is. So my question is, if and when you are confirmed in this position, would you agree that when we talk about the opioid crisis, the crisis in terms of methamphetamine addiction or any other controlled substance, that we should also acknowledge the public health ramifications and causes, and that there is a role for the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the United States to play in advocating for a public health response and not only a lock-'em-up response?
Well, I think the commission that was chaired by Governor Chris Christie came up with a three-pronged strategy, and I think that recognized that part of it was treatment and education, recovery, and prevention. But the third prong of it was enforcement and interdiction, and that's the job of the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice can't be all things to all people. And
Sir, but I would suggest to you that in the intervening almost 30 years since you were last Attorney General, that there is consensus in the United States that when we look at the drug epidemic, whatever the narcotic may be, that there's now an understanding that the war on drugs was an abject failure, that America, frankly, has a crisis of addiction, and that putting the limited resources of our federal government into locking up people who suffer from a public health crisis is probably not the smartest use of taxpayer dollars. So if confirmed, I'd ask that you take a look at the more recent perspective on the drug crisis that is afflicting our country. And then I'll move on. Today, there is $1 billion.
Can I just say something in response to that?
Sure.
Which is, I was just making the observation that the job of the Department of Justice is enforcement. I recognize there are a lot of dimensions to the problem, and that's why we have places like HHS. The department can't be, can't do the job of everybody.
Sir, but I would remind you what you said, because I agree with it. You said earlier the role of the Attorney General, one, is to enforce the rule of law, two, is a legal advisor to the President and the Cabinet, and three, is policy. This is a policy issue, so I'd urge you to emphasize that role and power that you will have if confirmed, and think of it that way.
I see you.
I'd like to talk with you about private prisons. There's a $1 billion private prison industry that profits off of incarcerating people, and frankly, as many as possible. By one estimate, the two largest private prison companies in the United States make a total combined profit of $3.3 billion. That's what it'd be, dollars a year. In August of 2016, the Justice Department issued a report on the Bureau of Prisons' use of private prisons that concluded, quote, contract prisons incurred more safety and security incidents per capita than comparable Bureau of Prisons institutions. Given this conclusion that prisons run by for-profit companies have been found to be less safe than government-run prisons, if confirmed, will you commit to no longer renew private prison contracts?
Whose report was this? BOP?
This was, yes, from the Justice Department.
Yeah, I'd like to, I would obviously look at that report. Yes.
Okay, and then...
But I'm not committing. I mean, I'd want to see what the report says.
Sure.
Yeah.
And then I'd appreciate a follow-up when you have a chance to read
Sure.
it. Thank you. My time's up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Barr, thank you for being here, and Liam, your granddaddy's doing good. Mr. Barr, I want to go back because it's a long time. I think I'm the last person in the first round, so I think we have to go back and maybe have you restate some things that you said earlier before I get to a few other things that I hope I have time to cover on intellectual property, Americans with Disability Act, and a GAO report back from 2014. I do have to ask a question while Senator Kennedy's here because I don't think he covered the full landscape. He asked about anybody in government, anyone in the Western Hemisphere, but did you in fact talk to anybody in the Eastern Hemisphere with respect to the Mueller probe?
No, I didn't.
Okay, thank you. We got that.
Ask him about the Milky Way.
We got that closed out. Would you go back again and please describe for me first off, I think you've made it very clear, in spite of the fact some people thought that you had coaching and some of the citations in the memo that you wrote, that this was a memo you wrote on your own. Can you explain to me again the motivation behind the memo, what precisely you were trying to communicate, just for the record?
Yes, Senator. So the public commentary and media commentary was sort of dominated by discussion of obstruction of justice, and everyone was throwing out obstruction theories and so forth. And the statute that relates to obstructing a proceeding that's not yet in being, that is some future proceeding, is 1512. And my view was of the particular provision, 1512C, was that it requires, what it covers is obstruction by means of impairing evidence, that you know some evidence is going to be needed in a future proceeding, and you impair it either by making it not available or by corrupting it in some way, altering it, destroying it. That's what I thought the scope of that statute dealt with. And to my knowledge, the only cases ever brought under it involved the destruction of evidence. Based on public reports, which may be completely wrong, I thought that it was being that the special counsel may be trying to interpret the statute to say that any act, not destruction of evidence or anything, but any act that influences a proceeding is a crime if it's done with a bad intent. My concern there is that unlike something like bribery statute or document destruction where you prohibit it, that's a bad act. You don't need to be performing that bad act if you're a government official. But if you say that any act that influences a proceeding is a crime if you have a bad state of mind, that's what the people at Justice Department do every day of the week, is influence proceedings. That's what they're there for. And what I was worried about is the impact on the department and other agencies if you say to someone, if you, in supervising a case or handling a case, make a decision for a bad intent, it can be a crime. And I thought that that would essentially paralyze the government. So just to give an example, you know, Eric Holder made some pardon recommendations during the Clinton administration, which were controversial. Incidentally, I supported Eric Holder for his position. But could someone come along then later and say, well, if you did that for a political reason to help Hillary Clinton run in New York, that's a crime? And when he's exercising his prerogatives, you know, in that situation, and you can just see how that could paralyze government. And that was my concern.
You also referred to your concerns with the prosecution of Senator Menendez. Did that weave into that same thought process?
Yes, because in that case, my concern was that they were basically taking activities that were not, you know, wrongful acts in themselves. You know, the political contributions were lawful political contributions, and the things with you know, the travel on his friend, that was his friend for 25 years. They were taking a trip together, and you take those kinds of things and then you couple it with official action, and then the prosecutor comes along and says, well, we're going to look into your mind and see what your subjective intent was for performing these two sets of lawful acts, and we're going to say, you know, that you're corrupt. Good. So I just think that gives too much power to the prosecutor, and I think if that kind of and by the way, you know, they've had cases like this for, you know, I mean, they've been pursuing things like this, and they've had to be slapped down a few times by the Supreme Court on these kinds of aggressive things involving, you know, quid pro quos on the Hill. So
let me, if I can, thank you. I just thought it was helpful because I think you tried to explain a lot of that and you were cut off, so I thought I'd use some of my time in the first round to ask you that. Also, I think somebody tried to characterize you as having somehow been opposed to any sort of Russia probe or Russia investigations. Have you ever gone on record as opposing any of the things that we're trying to do to figure out where Russia may have been involved in election tampering?
No, and in fact, in the op-ed piece where I said I thought the president was right in firing Comey, I said that the investigation was going forward under the supervision of Rod Rosenstein. Yeah.
Did you also say more than one time that you felt like the special counsel investigation should reach a conclusion, that that special counsel Mueller shouldn't be that he should be allowed to draw this to a conclusion, then he will submit his report, and you're going to do everything that you can to present as much of that information as you can, to the extent that confidential information is not being compromised?
To the extent the regulations permit it, yeah.
Did you also say that there's even a scenario where you can't imagine a scenario for cause, but even a scenario for cause where you'd have to take under serious consideration before you remove special counsel?
That's right.
Yeah, okay.
There hasn't been a special counsel removed since Archibald Cox, and that didn't work out.
Didn't work out too well, right. And again, did you also say that in no circumstances have you had a discussion with the president with respect to, I think you said you had a discussion about you had a relationship with Mr. Mueller, but no discussion about the special counsel investigation and your opinions on it with respect to any discussions you've had with the president?
Right. That was the first meeting I had with the president. And then in November, I met with him about the Attorney General job. And there was no discussion of the substance of the investigation. The president didn't ask me my views about any aspect of the investigation, and he didn't ask me about what I would do about anything in the investigation.
With respect to the line of questioning about the states that have legalized marijuana, either for medicinal purposes or recreational purposes, I think what you were trying to say in a very, very respectful way is it's not your job to do our job. Is that right? That if we ultimately want to provide certainty for these businesses. You've done a good job in saying that you disagree with the policy of the states, but we are where we are, and you would not want to undermine that given that investments have been made, states have moved forward. But at the end of the day, we should stop talking about it here and making it your job. And those members, I don't happen to be one of them, who think that we should take these federal laws off the books should probably file a bill and try and get it done. Is that a fair assessment of your opinion?
That's generally fair, yes.
Okay. Just a few minor things so that we can get to the next round. There was a report by the Inspector General in 2014 that had to do with accountability in the Department of Justice. I don't expect you to be familiar with this report, but there were some very interesting observations there about a lack of follow-through on disciplinary action for a number of I think the subtitle of the report was the DOJ could strengthen procedures for disciplining attorneys. It's something I would commend to you and maybe dust off and see if there have been any actions since this report. I didn't get a satisfactory answer when it was contemporary with a nominee from the Obama administration for the position you're seeking, which is one of the reasons why I opposed the nomination.
Actually, I think very highly of Inspector General Horowitz, and I haven't seen that report, but that issue is one that I plan to take up with him.
And then just so that I do finish on time versus pretend I'm going to and go 2 minutes early over. One, I want to get your recommendation on intellectual property. I think we have more work to do to give the Department of Justice tools to go after bad actors, which are China, Russia, India, a number of other countries, Brazil, that are stealing our intellectual property. Also want to talk about what I think is the exploitation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, particularly around website access. The web didn't exist, and now we have attorneys filing a number of frivolous lawsuits. Would like to get some feedback on that after you get confirmed. And finally, I want to make sure that you recognize in the First Step Act that faith-based organizations that have proven to help reduce recidivism are absolutely in play for the First Step Act, and hopefully we can make sure the Department of Justice move forward with that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
I believe that's the end of the first round. Mr. Barr, you're able to go for a little bit longer?
Sure.
Okay. So we'll do 5 minutes. As you can tell, I've been pretty liberal with the time, but let's try to honor it the best we can. Senator Grassley.
Okay. Where he left off on working with faith-based institutions, you were very positive about that?
Yeah, absolutely, Senator.
That takes care of my first question. Enforcement of the antitrust laws is extremely important to ensure that markets are fair and participants don't engage in abusive activity harming consumers. I've been particularly active in making sure that the Justice Department and Federal Trade Commission carefully scrutinize mergers, as well as looking out for anti-competitive behaviors and predatory practices in certain sectors of the economy, and particularly in my state of Iowa, the agricultural industry, but I'm also pursuing things in health care. In particular is because I will be chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, I'm interested in making sure that companies in drug and health care industries are playing by the rules. Everyone's concerned about the high cost of health care and especially the skyrocketing price of prescription drugs. Do you agree that the Justice Department has a very important role in this area?
Yes, Senator.
And would you commit to making antitrust enforcement a priority?
Yes, it has to be a priority.
Okay, thank you. Now to a favorite issue of mine, whistleblower protection. Whistleblowers, as I told you in my office, are very critical to exposing waste, fraud, and abuse. There are eyes and ears on the ground. Their courage, when they have it, and most of them do have great courage, or they wouldn't come forward to expose government malfeasance. That's how important they are. So I hope I can have you have a favorable view towards the opportunity to listen to whistleblowers, protect them from retaliation, and promote a culture that values important contribution from those patriotic people.
Absolutely, Senator.
Okay. Now to the Foreign Agents Registration Act. I hope you understand there have been very few prosecutions under the Foreign Agents Registration Act since 1938. And so that lax enforcement, I think, is getting, obviously, even since the Mueller investigation, getting a lot more attention now. But we had a hearing on it before the committee, and I think it proves that we should see more transparency and more enforcement against bad actors, not less. Do you agree that the Foreign Agents Registration Act is a critical national security and public accountability tool? And if confirmed, will you commit to make sure that that act is a top priority?
Yes, Senator.
Okay. So then getting back to legislation that I think will improve that 1938 Act, I introduced the Disclosing Foreign Influence Act to improve transparency, accountability, and enforcement. You haven't probably read that act, but I'd like to work with you, even though it's not in this committee, it's in Foreign Relations Committee. I'd like to have you work with us so it's something that we can pass and make sure that this law is more useful than it has been over the last 80 years. I support the Freedom of Information Act and the public disclosure of government records. Transparency yields accountability. You hear me say that all the time, and that's true no matter who's in the White House. When I was chairman of the committee, I helped steer FOIA Improvement Act into law, which creates a presumption of openness, and that presumption of openness is a very important standard. The Justice Department oversees the federal government's compliance with FOIA. So I hope you would agree that FOIA is an important tool for holding government accountable. And if confirmed, then would you make sure it's a top priority to make FOIA and the faithful and timely implementation of the 2016 amendments a top priority?
Yes, we'll work hard on that.
Because you know what really happens in the bowels of the bureaucracy? It just takes them forever because maybe something's going to embarrass them, so they don't want it out in the public. So you get all sorts of excuses. We got to do away with those excuses. One way to make FOIA work better is by reducing the number of requests. This will have to be my last question. One way to make FOIA work better is by reducing the number of requests that have to be made in the first place. That's why I'm a strong advocate for improved proactive disclosure. If confirmed, will you commit to help advocate for more proactive disclosure of government records? Now, that's not just by the Justice Department, but because your government or your department's top dog in this particular area in the federal government overall.
Yes, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Feinstein.
Mr. Barr, I see you have staying power, but I see it runs in the family, and particularly your grandson. I'd like to send a little care package down to him. He deserves a medal.
We'll get that to her. There you go.
Thank you, Senator.
You're welcome.
He doesn't have to share it with the rest of the family.
In 1994, you said that gun control is a dead end. It won't reduce the level of violent crime in our society. The year you made this comment, I introduced a federal assault weapons ban, and the president signed it into law. A 2016 study shows that compared with the 10-year period before the ban was enacted, the number of gun massacres between 94 and 04 fell by 37%, and the number of people dying from gun massacres fell by 43%. In addition, between 2004 and 2014, there has been a 183% increase in massacres and a 239% increase in massacre deaths. Do you still believe that prudent controls on weapons won't reduce violent crime? And if so, what is your basis for this conclusion?
I think that the problem of our time is to get an effective system in place that can keep dangerous firearms out of the hands of mentally ill people. That should be priority number one, and it's going to take some hard work, and we need to get on top of the problem. We need to come up with agreed-to standards that are prohibitors of people who are mentally ill. We have to put the resources in to get the system built up the way we did many years ago on the felon records and so forth. We have to get the system working, and as I say, it's sort of piecemeal a little bit right now. We need to really get some energy behind it and get it done, and I also think we need to push along the ERPOs so that we have these red flag laws to supplement the use of the background check to find out if someone has some mental disturbance. This is the single most important thing I think we can do in the gun control area to stop these massacres from happening in the first place.
Well, thank you. I'd like to work with you in that regard. Yes. In August of 2002, the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel issued opinions authorizing enhanced interrogation methods that included waterboarding and extended sleep deprivation. These opinions were later withdrawn, and the Justice Department's Office of Professional Responsibility found that they reflected a lack of, this is a quote, a lack of thoroughness, objectivity, and candor, end quote. In 2015, I worked with Senator McCain to pass legislation making clear that enhanced interrogation techniques are unlawful and limiting authorized interrogation techniques to those listed in the Army Field Manual. And that is the law today. If confirmed, will you ensure that the Justice Department upholds the law?
Yes, Senator. I think that was an important change because I think it gave clarity to the law, and I will support that.
Thank you. I'm delighted to hear that. And now, a lot of us have asked about the Mueller report and whether you would commit to providing it to Congress. When asked, I thought you said yes, but when I tried to clarify it, I meant the full report, including obstruction of justice. You again said yes. Then when Senator Blumenthal asked you about the Mueller report, you seemed to make a distinction and said you were going to provide your own report based on Mueller's report, but not the report, this is the way we understood it, but not the report he submits at the end of the investigation. This is concerning, as there is nothing in the regulations that prevent you from providing Mueller's report to Congress. While the regs refer to a confidential report to be provided to the Attorney General, the regs do not state that confidentiality means the report cannot be provided to Congress. So here's the question. Will you provide Mueller's, Mueller's report to Congress, not your rewrite or a summary?
Well, the regs do say that Mueller is supposed to do a summary report of his prosecutive and his declination decisions, and that They will be handled as a confidential document as our internal documents relating to any federal criminal investigation. Now, I'm not sure, and then the AG has some flexibility and discretion in terms of the AG's report. What I am saying is my objective and goal is to get as much as I can of the information to Congress and the public. And, you know, these are departmental regulations, and I'm going to be talking to Rod Rosenstein and Bob Mueller. I'm sure they've had discussions about this. There's probably existing thinking in the department as to how to handle this. But all I can say at this stage, because I have no clue as to what's being planned, is that I am going to try to get the information out there consistent with these regulations. And to the extent I have discretion, I will exercise that discretion to do that.
Well, I can only speak for this side, and maybe not all this side, but we really appreciate that. And the degree to which you can get us a prompt report in the fullest possible form would be really appreciated. And I think there has to be a realization, too, among the administration that this is an issue of real concern to people and to the Congress, and we should be able to see the informed information that comes out. So
I understand.
I'm very hopeful.
Thank you.
Let me ask this question on enhanced, did my time run out?
But go ahead.
On enhanced interrogation. During a 2005 panel discussion, you said the following, I think, about interrogating suspected terrorists, and I quote, "Under the laws of war, absent a treaty, there's nothing wrong with coercive interrogation, applying pain, discomfort, and other things to make people talk, so long as it doesn't cross the line and involve the gratuitous barbarity involved in torture," end quote. This is a panel discussion, Civil Liberties and Security, July 18, 2005. Do you believe that torture is ever lawful?
No.
Is waterboarding torture?
You know, I'd have to look at the legal definition. You're talking about under the, right now, it's prohibited. So, you know, the law has definitively dealt with that. I can't even remember what the old law was that defined torture. I'd have to look at that and then, you know, figure out what's involved in it. But sorry.
Keep going. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, it's okay, sir. Sorry.
At what point does interrogation cross the line to the gratuitous barbarity involved in torture? That's your quote.
Well, I wasn't using that as a legal, the gratuitous barbarity. That's what I was I was saying torture is gratuitous barbarity. So I wasn't saying that gratuitous.
Oh, well, that's helpful then. That's helpful.
Yeah.
And you define waterboarding. You know, one would think these questions would never be necessary. I've thought that all my life, and then I found I was wrong, and they really are. Mm-hmm. And I was chairman of intelligence when we did the big torture report, and what I found and what I saw was really indicative of reform. So I think for the Attorney General, knowing the position is really very important. Right. So maybe you could concisely state your position on torture.
I don't think we should ever use torture. And I think that the clarification that was it your legislation of the putting in the Army, the field manual.
That's right.
Was important to clarifying where the line is.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cornett.
Mr. Barr, I want to talk about guns, and I want to talk about China in the 5 minutes we have together. Back in 1992, there was some discussion about your position on Congress's role when it comes to banning certain types of semi-automatic weapons. Sometimes people call those assault weapons. But in the intervening years, the Supreme Court has now spoken in both the Heller and McDonald case, and recognize that the Second Amendment confers an individual and fundamental right to bear arms. Could you sort of bring us up to date from your views in 1992 and how they were affected by Heller and McDonald and what your views now are on the Second Amendment?
Sure. I think I opposed an assault weapon ban because I felt that that was really sort of the aesthetics of the gun. And but you know, since that time, Heller has been decided. Actually, before Heller, I did work at OLC on this issue, and I personally concluded that the Second Amendment creates a personal right under the Constitution. It's based on the Lockean notion of the right of self-preservation. It's tied to that. And I was glad to see Heller come out and vindicate that initial view that I had. And so there's no question under Heller that the right to have weapons is firearms is protected under the Second Amendment and is a personal right. At the same time, there's room for reasonable regulation. And you know, from my standpoint, what I would look for is in assessing a regulation is what's the burden on law-abiding people, and is it proportionate to whatever benefit in terms of safety and effectiveness will be conferred. As I said just a moment ago, let's get down to the real problem we're confronting, which is keeping these weapons out of the hands of people who are mentally ill. And I think all the rest of this stuff is really essentially rhetoric until we really get that problem dealt with in terms of regulatory approaches.
Well, as our colleague, the senator from Louisiana, Senator Kennedy, likes to say, the Bill of Rights is not an a la carte menu. And I agree with that. I also agree that there are many facets to these mass violence incidents. After the shooting at Sutherland Springs, we found out that the background check system, the National Instant Criminal Background Check system, was not being used appropriately by the U.S. government, in that case the Air Force. And if it had been, this individual who killed 20 people, injured 26 more at a Baptist church right outside of San Antonio, would not have been able to legally get his hands on the firearm by lying. Mm-hmm. But certainly the mental health issue that you mentioned, we've done work there with
fixed NICS.
In the fixed NICS area. We've also done expanded pilot programs on assisted outpatient treatment for people suffering from mental illness, recognizing that it's difficult for any family member to control, particularly an adult, but that providing an opportunity to go to court and get basically a civil order that would require them to comply with their doctor's orders, take their medication and the like. I'm thinking of Adam Lanza at the Sandy Hook shooting, whose mother did not know how to control him as he was getting more and more ill, and only to have him take her very weapon and then kill her and then go murder the innocent children. So, right. On China, do you agree with me that China represents probably one of the preeminent economic challenges to America, particularly because of their theft of intellectual property and their exploitation of gaps in foreign investment that we've tried to address through improvement of the CFIUS process, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States? But talk to me a little bit about what you see the challenge of China, both economically and from a national security standpoint.
Well, I think they're the paramount economic and military rival in the world. I think that they are very formidable because they take the long view. They've been stealing our technology, and they've been gradually building up their military power and investing in new technologies. I think from a military standpoint, it's very disturbing how much progress they're making, largely based on U.S. technology. I was very, I really thought that Attorney General Sessions was right on target in setting up his China initiative in the department to start going after the pirating of American technology and other kinds of illegal activities that Chinese nationals are involved in here in the United States and even abroad.
Do you share my skepticism at Chinese telecommunications companies like Huawei and ZTE in terms of how that, once in the hands or in the networks of unsuspecting countries, that could be used for espionage purposes and theft of intellectual property?
Yes, in fact, even in my old Verizon days, we understood the danger and would not use that kind of equipment, even though it would be economically attractive.
Before Senator Lee, I'd like to, on behalf of Senator Feinstein, introduce into the record letters that express opposition and concern from groups like the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, Planned Parenthood, People for the American Way, National Education Association, Alliance for Justice, NARAL, National Urban League, the National Council of Jewish Women, Center for American Progress, and the Human Rights Campaign, and a letter from Representative Paul Garvala. I hope I got his name right, from Arizona. In support, we have letters from the International Association of Chiefs of Police, a letter from the National Fraternal Order of Police, numerous letters signed from 100 former federal law enforcement, national security officials, including 3 former attorney generals, and a lot of U.S. attorneys and heads of the CIA, FBI, and Department of Homeland Security, a letter from the National Narcotics Officers Association, a letter from the International Union of Public Police Associations, a letter from Major Cities Chiefs Association, a letter from the Association of State Criminal Investigative Agencies. Without objection, I'd like to enter all that into the record. Senator Leahy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just when you just mentioned being at Verizon during the NSA's metadata program, we also had the PRISM upstream. It required telecom, internet providers, hand over huge amounts of data to the government. And you testified in 2003, the law is clear that a person has no Fourth Amendment rights in these records left in the hands of third parties, the third-party doctrine. I actually disagreed with you at that time, and I hope you would now, especially as the Carpenter decision that just came down and written by Chief Justice Roberts, that this is generally requiring the government to get a warrant to obtain geolocation information through cell site location information. Does that change the opinion you had back then?
Well, it sounds like I haven't read that decision, Senator. It may modify my views. I'd have to read the decision. I was going on the Miller decision relating to bank records. But also, you mentioned you were tying this to the NSA collection because, and then tying it to my testimony because,
Well, you had said that no person has no Fourth Amendment rights to these records left in the hands of third parties, the third-party doctrine.
Yeah, that was the.
Which seems to be undercut by Carpenter.
Okay, I'll take a look at that. But
then would you?
I don't want people to have the impression that Verizon was involved in.
Would you respond
spying.
for the record?
Yes, sure, certainly.
And you said back in November 2017, you saw more basis for investigating the Uranium One deal than supposed collusion between President Trump and Russia. And by not pursuing these matters, the department is abdicating its responsibility. Just about everybody's debunked the Uranium One controversy. I think probably the nail in the coffin was President Trump's biggest supporter, Fox News, debunked it. Did I miss something in there?
No, actually, you'll notice that there were no quotes around that, and then the next sentence is plural matters. And my recollection of that is what, I think it was relating to the letter and the appointment of Huber in Utah to look into a number of things. And the point I was trying to make there was that whatever the standard is for launching an investigation, it should be dealt with even-handedly. Whatever that trigger is should be applied to all. I have no knowledge of the uranium one. I didn't particularly think that was necessarily something that should be pursued aggressively. I was trying to make the point that there was a lot out there, and I think all that stuff at the time was being looked at by Huber. That's my recollection. I may be wrong on that.
Well, I think the fact that the investigation has been pretty well debunked, we don't have to worry about it in the future. But we do have one thing that's happening right now. The Trump shutdown is in its 25th day. Justice Department has 13,000 FBI agents, 16,000 prison guards, 3,600 U.S. Marshals, 4,300 drug enforcement agents. They're all working without pay. The FBI Agents Association, I realize it's not part of the government, but the association described the effect of the shutdown as a potential national security issue. So let me just ask you, in your years of experience at the department, what impact do you believe a long-term shutdown has on law enforcement?
Well, I think most people involved in law enforcement are, I don't know if the lingo is still the same. They used to be called essential. I think it's been changed to something else, but I think they're on the job. But obviously, people would like to see the shutdown ended, and that's why people want to see some kind of compromise. And you call it the Trump shutdown, but I mean, it takes two to tango, and you sort of wonder why
only
can't
because he called it that.
Oh.
His meeting at the
Okay.
White House, and I said, finally, I've got something I could agree with him on. And because Senator Shelby and I had put together appropriations bills that passed almost unanimously in the Senate at a time when that would have kept the government open. That's at a time when it's hard to get something unanimous saying the sun would rise in the east. And I was just agreeing with the president, but no matter what you call it, isn't it a fact that this does have an effect on law enforcement?
Well, not having a wall also has an effect on law enforcement.
Yeah. Well, and not paying our law enforcement people. We both had experience in law enforcement, you at the national level, me at the state level. You don't pay our law enforcement people, I think there's an effect. You have some very dedicated people, but you have some very distracted people. Do you believe that voter ID laws and similar restrictions on voting actually promote democracy by discouraging voters who are not really paying attention to what's going on? Going back to a panel discussion you had a few years ago.
Yeah. What I said there was that in that panel discussion, there was a lot of people complaining about the lack of, that many Americans aren't educating themselves about the issues and they're passive, and that it was important to, and also that the voting participation was dropping. And I said my position was that the underlying problem is the citizen, the citizen who's not paying attention to public events, not educating themselves about the issues and so forth, and that the non-voting is a symptom. And I didn't see driving up participation as addressing the primary underlying problem. That was my point, and I pointed out that when the Constitution was adopted, the turnout was about 33%, my understanding. So, and then I said, low participation has been a problem from the very beginning. But my view is that voter turnout shouldn't be artificially driven up without also addressing the issue of an informed citizenry, which I think is a problem.
We do have voting laws that guard against discrimination, the arbitrary closing of voting booths in a predominantly African-American area, for example. Would you have any problem in vigorously enforcing our voting rights laws that are on the books?
Of what? Vigorously? No, not at all. I said one of my priorities would be that. I think we have to enforce the voting rights. And I wasn't suggesting that voting should be suppressed. I was just saying that the low turnout is ultimately attributable to sort of the, I don't know what the word to use is, but, you know, the citizenry doesn't seem to be that engaged, you know, in the public affairs of the country.
Well, they are in Vermont.
Hmm?
So they are in Vermont.
Yeah,
We have one of the highest turnouts in the country.
That's good. Yeah, excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We're going to have two votes at 4:10. Can you go for a bit longer? Senator Sass.
Thank you, Chairman. General, I'd like to return to the disturbing topics of human trafficking and sex trafficking. You've answered a few questions here today. I'd like to look at the November 28th Miami Herald investigative series that I know that you followed into the crimes of Jeffrey Epstein, and I want to quote from that. Epstein, a wealthy hedge fund manager, quote, assembled a large cult-like network of underage girls with the help of young female recruiters to coerce into having sex acts behind the walls of his opulent waterfront mansion as often as 3 times a day, close quote. The report continues, he was also suspected of trafficking minor girls, often from overseas, for sex parties at his other homes in Manhattan, New Mexico, and the Caribbean. The Herald series continues, quote, in 2007, despite ample physical evidence and multiple witnesses corroborating the girls' stories, federal prosecutors and Epstein's lawyers quietly put together a remarkable deal for Epstein, then age 54. He agreed to plead guilty to 2 felony prostitution charges in state court, and in exchange, he and his accomplices received immunity from federal sex trafficking charges that could have sent him to prison for the rest of his life. He served 13 months in a private wing of the Palm Beach County Stockade. His alleged co-conspirators who helped schedule his sex sessions were never prosecuted, and the deal, called, again, this is the Miami Herald, a federal non-prosecution agreement, was sealed so that no one, not even his victims, could know the full scope of Epstein's crimes and who else was involved, close quote. The fact that federal prosecutors appear to have crafted this secret sweetheart deal for a child rapist obviously enrages moms and dads everywhere. On this particular case, will you commit to making sure that there's a full and thorough investigation into the way DOJ handled the Epstein case?
So, Senator, I have to recuse myself from Kirkland and Ellis matters, I am told, and I think Kirkland and Ellis was maybe involved in that case, so I need to sort out exactly what my role can be. But, you know, I will say that if I'm confirmed, I'll make sure your questions are answered on this case.
Thank you. The Deputy Attorney General, obviously there have been media reports about the timing of his potential departure post your confirmation, and the DAG, as you well know from your prior history, has a key responsibility in deconflicting different parts of the department. Those of us who've been pressing on this matter have found in different parts of the department a lot of anxiety about the way this was handled, and yet kind of a hot potato of a bunch of people thinking they're not responsible. Right now, Rod Rosenstein has been helping, trying to deconflict some of that, but I'm worried if, with your potential recusal, if the DAG also departs, it's not clear who's going to actually deconflict this. So I'm grateful for your pledge that the department will be responsive, even if not you personally.
Yes, that's right.
More broadly than the miscarriage of justice in this particular Florida case, would you agree that justice has nothing to do with the size of your bank account or the number of attorneys you can hire?
Yes.
I agree, and I think that a whole bunch of Americans wonder about the Department of Justice and how we're trying to prioritize, or how we should be prioritizing, our responsibility to the victims of sex trafficking who are left afraid and voiceless. In this particular case, many of the women who were clearly victims, trafficked, rape victims, had no awareness of the fact, and I think in violation of federal statutes of victim notification, that this non-prosecution agreement had been agreed to, and not just that Epstein and his co-conspirators were not indicted, but the rest of the investigatory matters of the department were also suspended. It seems truly bizarre.
Mm-hmm.
I think moms and dads watching this hearing would like to know that you will pledge broadly to attack sex trafficking as a scourge in our society on both the supply side and the demand side, as these dirtbags demand this, but on the supply side, as organizations clearly perpetrate these crimes. Can you pledge to us that this will be one of your priorities at the department?
They can count on it.
Thank you, sir.
I want to associate myself with what Senator Sass said about the Epstein case and the problem in general. And to the extent you can help us figure this out, please.
Yes.
Senator Durbin.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barr, thank you for being with us. Mr. Barr, my colleague Senator Ernst asked a question earlier, which I'm sure would be asked in virtually every state we represent, what we're doing to stop the flow of narcotics into the United States. She asked about meth, I believe in particular, but about narcotics coming in from Mexico, and your reply was, and I quote, "It is the major avenue of how drugs come into the country. They come across that border. I feel it is a critical part of border security, and we need barriers on the border." That was your quote. I'm troubled by that answer, and I'd like to clarify it, because if we're ever going to have a rational conversation about border security, there ought to be some basics that we agree on. The DEA, which you'll supervise if confirmed, in its 2018 report said, quote, "The most common method employed by the Mexican drug cartels involves transporting illicit drugs through U.S. ports of entry in passenger vehicles which concealed compartments are commingled with legitimate goods on tractor trailers." The Customs and Border Protection's own data shows that customs officers at legal ports of entry seized the vast majority of lethal narcotics coming into this country. In fiscal year 2017, last year we have data, 87% of the fentanyl, which has been identified as CDC as the most deadly narcotic in America, 87% seized in our country coming in through ports of entry, 13% seized outside of ports of entry. So overwhelmingly, when we talk about building new walls and barriers to stop narcotics, we're ignoring the obvious. 80 to 90% of the drugs are coming in through ports of entry. I met with the head of Customs and Border Protection. He said the number one thing we can do is to put technology in the ports of entry to scan the vehicles coming through. Currently, only 17% of trucks and cars coming through those ports of entry are being scanned, 17%. That means 83% of them are just flowing right on through there, bringing narcotics to Iowa and to Illinois. Building a new concrete wall from sea to shining sea doesn't even address this issue. Technology does. I want to reach the point where we open the government and have this honest conversation. Would you reconsider your earlier answer as to the fact that we need to build more barriers to stop narcotics from coming into the United States?
Well, it wasn't tied just to narcotics. It was tied to overall border security.
You said a major avenue for how drugs come into this country. It's not.
I said was across the border. Wait a minute.
The border is the major avenue, but your answer was we need barriers on the border.
Right, and because we need barriers on the border for border security. Part of what we're trying to do is cut down on drugs. It's also illegal aliens. It's also other people from other countries who may wish to do harm in the United States that are coming in, and barriers are part of the answer. And from my experience, the threat is always dynamic. You put technology at the ports of entry, they'll shift somewhere else. It's a moving target, always has been, and I think we need a system that covers all the bases.
I think the reason we cannot reach an agreement with the Trump administration is fundamental to our exchange, and it's this. I don't disagree with you with the notion that barriers from sea to shining sea will at least slow people down. But when it comes to the next marginal dollar to protect kids in Illinois and children in your home state, it's ports of entry. It's technology to keep these narcotics out of the United States. And if we can't really start at the same premise based on reports from the president's own administration, we're never going to reach a point of bipartisan agreement on border security. So I think we're close to agreeing, and maybe it's semantics, I hope not. But I hope that we can agree that if we're going to stop narcotics, it's technology and personnel. The experts tell us that. It's not a wall. And I hope that we can move from there. The last question I'll ask you, in a limited time, they asked me about your statements this morning your testimony, and I thought they were good, responsive in the most part. The one thing I'm stuck on, and many are, is this report you gave to this administration in June of last year about the investigation of the president.
You mean my memo?
Yes.
My memo, yeah.
And you said in there, Mueller should not be permitted to demand that the president submit to interrogation about alleged obstruction. You volunteered that. I'm trying to get around this. Okay. It sounds like it was an effort on your part to ingratiate yourself with an administration which is now nominating you for Attorney General. I'll give you one last chance. My time is up. Please respond.
Okay. Well, first, what I was saying there was, again, based on speculation on my part, was that there has to be an adequate predicate, and if he was relying on just the firing of Mueller or the statement about Flynn and this specific statute, those two things, I didn't think it was an adequate predicate. I wasn't saying he may have other facts, he may have other theories that would support it. I was just pinpointing that. Number two, I can assure you I was not trying to ingratiate myself with anybody. The furthest thing from my mind was coming back into government, I can assure you that. And if I wanted to ingratiate myself or signal things, there are a lot more direct ways of doing it than that.
For the record, I think you meant the firing of Mr. Comey. I think you said Mueller.
Oh, okay, yeah. What did I say? Oh, yeah, the firing of Comey. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Just trying to help you.
Thank you. I'll just take a couple of seconds to see if I can help clarify this, because I think it's been a very interesting hearing. So if there was some reason to believe that the president tried to coach somebody not to testify or testify falsely, that could be obstruction of justice.
Yes, under that. Yeah, under an obstruction statute, right. Yes.
So if there's some evidence that the president tried to conceal evidence, that would be obstruction of justice potentially, right?
Right.
Your point is just simply firing somebody, which is a personnel decision, is problematic for the system.
Right, especially if you, what I'm saying is that doesn't fit under that statute. No, I got Show me some other statute, but that statute, no.
Yeah, okay. Who's next? Senator Hawley. Senator Hawley, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barr, switching gears a little bit. Yesterday, a federal district court judge in Pennsylvania struck down the Trump administration's religious and moral exemptions to the contraceptive mandate under the Affordable Care Act. As part of this ruling, the district court judge issued a nationwide injunction to any enforcement or application of these rules. This is a growing trend. We've seen a lot of this in the last 2 years. We've seen lots and lots of district courts all across the country in various contexts, in the immigration context and others, issue nationwide injunctions. And now, of course, for those listening at home, the entire nation is not within the jurisdiction of these courts. These courts are district courts. They reach a specific geographic areas delineated by law, and yet they're issuing increasingly commonly these injunctions that reach the entire country. This is a fairly unusual and fairly recent practice. In distinction to this, the district court judge in Texas, who recently heard a challenge to the Affordable Care Act case, did not issue a nationwide injunction, and therefore allowing the appeals process to take its normal course. And of course, the ACA remains in full effect throughout that appeals process because he did not issue a nationwide injunction. So my question is to you, are you concerned about this growing practice of nationwide injunctions by federal district courts, and what do you think ought to be done about it?
Yes, I'm very concerned by it. Earlier I was talking about this and saying that I think it mistakes the limitation on judicial power, which is a case or controversy limitation, and tries to grant relief to people who are not part of the case or controversy that's being decided. And as you said, it's really started in the 60s, and it's been picking up steam. And the fact of the matter is there are a lot of district court judges, and you can usually find one who somewhere in the country will agree with you. And so major democratic decisions can be held up by one judge nationwide. I'm also concerned that there's another trend, which is the willingness of some district court judges to wade into matters of national security, where in the past courts would not have presumed to be enjoining those kinds of things. And then the appeals process takes a long time, and so a lot of damage can be done before it gets to the Supreme Court and you get a definitive decision. And meanwhile, everything is stuck.
Can you just say more? You're concerned about courts that wade into national security issues where traditionally they have hesitated to do so. Can you just say more about that? What do you have in mind?
Like the travel ban.
Mm-hmm. And the concern there is that,
I mean, the president takes something based on national security and and the Constitution vests that kind of judgment for that kind of emergency act or act that he has the authority to perform to protect the country. He's politically accountable for that, and yet a judge with a lifetime appointment sitting somewhere in the country who doesn't have the access to the information, has no political accountability, can stop a national security measure, globally, essentially. And it takes a long time to get that sorted out. That's really troublesome to me.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Let me ask you about another recent case, this one from the Southern District of New York today, in which the district courts ruled that the attempt to include, the attempt by the Commerce Department to include a citizenship question on the census is not permissible, and has stopped the Commerce Department from including that on the 2020 census. The department has argued, of course, and the Department of Justice is defending this decision, that including a citizenship question, as was done for approximately 100 years on the census, actually helps identify with greater accuracy the residents of the country who is and who is not a citizen, and of course helps more accurately apportion and draw congressional districts and make sure that representation is fair and the Voting Rights Act is fairly enforced. Do you agree with that position?
Well, it's being litigated now, so I really would prefer not to comment on it.
Do you anticipate that the Department of Justice will continue its vigorous defense of the position that the administration has taken?
I think generally I have no reason to change that position. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you. Mr. Barr, in order to perform its counterintelligence function effectively, what should the Department of Justice and the FBI know about the business relationships and entanglements of senior officials with foreign interests and governments?
Well, usually, I guess usually investigations are started because there's some act that comes to the attention of the law enforcement agency that suggests someone is being disloyal to the United States.
Except where
and working for a foreign excuse me?
Except where we require disclosures in order to give the law enforcement folks that advantage of knowing in advance when a senior official has a business entanglement with a foreign interest or power.
Mm-hmm.
So what should we know?
What official are we talking about?
Well, let's start with the president.
Are you suggesting the president go through a background investigation by the FBI?
No, I'm suggesting that when there's evidence that he has business relationships with foreign interests, then that may be a factual determination that would be of some note to our counterintelligence folks.
Well, the financial disclosures that I think are filed by other, I don't even know if members of Congress file financial disclosures, do they?
Yeah.
They do.
So do many officials in the executive branch. So
that's for financial conflict. I don't think that's for counterintelligence purposes.
Probably because very few people have business relationships with foreign interests, so it turns up much more often in a conflict.
Well, business relationship with a foreign interest is not ordinarily a counterintelligence concern.
Unless, of course,
the person is a traitor.
Or in a position to make decisions that are biased or influenced by those business relationships.
Well,
counterintelligence and treason are not the same thing, are they?
Counterintelligence, you're usually trying to counter the intelligence activities of another country.
Correct. And you may want to head off things. You may want to be aware of things. You may want to. There are a whole lot of things short of treason that are the counterintelligence function.
Right. Including, counterintelligence focuses usually on foreign intelligence services and their activities.
Trying to
American
officials.
I think we're mixing apples and grapes or whatever here, because
financial
financial disclosure
we're just having a hard time answering what ought to be a really easy question, which is that when a senior government official has business relationships with foreign interests and powers, we ought to know about it. That ought to be an easy proposition, and in any other administration it would be.
Well, did congressmen go through background investigations to get access to classified information?
That's a whole separate question.
No, it's exactly the same question.
We do a lot more reporting than we do.
Well, your financial reporting, with all due respect, is not the same as a background investigation. You're elected by the people to hold an office, and, you don't get a background investigation to get on the Intelligence Committee.
But we do have to do a lot of reporting. Okay, you don't want to answer it. I'll move on. Let's talk about corruptly in obstruction cases. I'm not sure I heard you correctly, so I want to make sure you have the chance to explain. But it sounded like you were saying that the word corruptly, used, as you said, adverbally, was a requirement that there be some form of destruction or interference with evidence. I have always read that term corruptly in obstruction of justice to impose an intent requirement, which is also what the Criminal Resources Manual of the Department of Justice says, and what I think virtually every appellate court has said. So it worries me if what you are trying to do here is to redefine the obstruction statute by narrowing the intent requirement and using the term corruptly to refer to something very different, which is the actual physical corruption changing or damaging.
I think I can allay your concerns.
Could you do that? Because
if you look at the memo, you'll see that my discussion of corruptly is not up in the plain meaning section, where I'm talking about how you interpret the statute. And my basic argument as to why the statute covers destruction of evidence and hiding evidence and stuff like that is based on the word otherwise. Supreme Court decisions in Yates and Begay, also the fact that if you actually read it otherwise, it swallows up all. It becomes a one-clause, it wipes out everything else.
If I can just cut to the...
So then later on I point out in my memo, I point out that reading is also supported by the understanding of the word corruptly, which the Poindexter case, D.C. Circuit case, I think had the most intelligent discussion of the word corruptly, which is it does refer to the kind of activity that's necessary, which is perverting a proceeding by corrupting it.
So in the event that the Mueller investigation has turned up evidence of obstruction of justice by the president or people close to him, you would follow the Department of Justice's existing legal guidance with respect to what that word corruptly means.
My interpretation of the statute was not predicated entirely on the word corruptly. I was just pointing out.
And it is not your intention to change department policy or department standards or department definitions, particularly as they may bear on obstruction by the president or people around him.
That's right.
Thank you.
We're about to vote. Let's do one more. You deserve a break. You've done great. One, Senator Ernst, then we'll take a break, go vote. I'm going to vote and come back, give you about 15 minutes, and we'll just plow through till we're done. Senator Tillis?
Well, I'll be brief. One question, because people have asked, they've gone to the wall. It almost sounds like they're trying to suggest that you believe that the fix for border security is a 2,300-mile physical barrier from the Pacific to the Gulf. Do you believe that's the best way to secure the border?
I'm not sure what the current thinking is on this, but when I was looking...
Have you ever advocated for a wall or some sort of monolithic structure as the plan for securing the border?
No. But I do believe we need to have a system all the way across. When I was looking at this, there were certain areas where, a wall didn't make any sense.
You've used the word barrier. I don't think a 30-foot wall makes sense on, for example, 1,000-foot cliff.
Right.
Or one that's out in the middle of nowhere. Would you agree that, when we get away from this childish, everybody's saying it's a wall or not, that we're probably, the president's repeatedly said that we need wall structures, we may need steel slat structures, we may need to reinforce chain link fences with all-weather roads. We need aerostats so that we can identify people crossing the border that are otherwise desolate and not very frequently crossed. We need border patrol agents, and we need technology that interdicts all the illicit drugs at the legal ports of entry, that those are all elements of a barrier that actually will better prepare us to secure the border, eliminate the poison coming across the border, and perhaps reduce the amount of human trafficking that's coming through the legal ports of entry. Is that a better way to characterize your position on barriers that either are physical, technological, or otherwise?
Yes.
Thank you. Also, I can't leave without going back to, you were talking about a time when I was in my early 30s. I remember vividly just how dangerous things were getting back in the early 90s. I was 30 years old in 1990. I remember vividly the news reports and everything that we were trying to do to get ahead of the murderous environment that we were in. I think some people are trying to project, or at least maybe I've inferred, maybe incorrectly, but project what you were trying to do or what you were advocating for in the midst of a crisis, which was not mass incarceration of low-level nonviolent criminals,
right,
onto your view of, let's say, the First Step Act and what we're trying to do today. If you, hypothetical, maybe you can't answer it, but let's say you were Attorney General when we were moving First Step, which I supported. I supported criminal justice reforms in North Carolina when I was Speaker of the House. Are you fundamentally opposed to what we're trying to do with the First Step Act?
No, I think some of those things make sense. If I had been at the table, I probably would have urged a few changes to it. But, overall, I don't have a problem with it.
And you're fully aware the President and folks in the White House are supportive of the act. And
yes.
So you'll do everything you can to help us take that intent, the statutory intent, the things that you'll need to do is implement in your role as Attorney General. I do believe you're going to be confirmed to make sure that we get the full positive effect that we'll get out of the First Step Act.
That's right, Senator. And, there were a number of things being lumped together. What I espoused in the 90s, when we had the highest crime rates in our history, was taking the chronic violent offenders with long criminal history records of predatory violence, and especially the ones that use guns in multiple offenses, and getting them off the streets and into prison.
And I think you made the point that in some cases you were able to more clearly present evidence where they were involved in drug trafficking, but you knew damn well that they were a part of what was murdering these communities and making them very dangerous. And the point there was you were using every device possible to get them behind bars and off the streets so that you could make those communities safer, including the communities in Trenton, New Jersey.
Right. Yeah. So the other thing were, then there are drug penalties. And some of the drug penalties, yes, were draconian, and there were rational reasons for doing that at the time. And sometimes people got and we weren't going after people who needed treatment, who were, just because they were addicts. We were going after the people who were distributing the drugs. And, in the current circumstance, I understand there's data to support what was done in First Step. I understand those changes on the drug front. But I would not let up on chronic violent offenders because they commit a disproportionate amount of the predation in society.
I hope you don't, because they need to go behind bars for a very, very long time. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Barr. What we'll do, we'll come back with Senator Klobuchar. We're going to take a 15-minute break, and hopefully by then, both of us can vote and come back and continue, and we're just going to plow through till we get done today. So we'll be in recess for 15 minutes.
Is this a spelling?
Hi everyone, my name's Mike. I'm the creator of Mox News, and for the last 15 years I have been telling you that as long as I have the support of the community that I serve, Mox News will post videos forever. And that's the truth. As long as I have your support, no one could ever make me stop. Unfortunately, currently, less than 1/2 of 1/10 of 1% of Mox News viewers ever donate, tip, or contribute anything back. Again, let me make that really clear. Much less than 1/2 of 1/10 of 1% ever give anything back. And to those of you who have donated to Mox News, I want to thank you so much, because it's because of your generosity that we have been able to bring attention to important videos that millions and millions of eyes would have never seen. And I think that that's an amazing thing that we've been able to make happen together. And I can't thank you enough for helping me make that happen. So it's not too late. If you'd like to see Mox News covering the 2020 presidential election, if you can't imagine the 2020 presidential election without Mox News, please, there's still time. You can make a difference. It's easy to make a contribution, donation, or tip. You can go to moxnews.com, or in the text body of this video, there are clickable links to the Patreon page or to the PayPal page. And again, it should take less than 2 minutes to make a donation, and your donation can make a big difference. So I thank you all. Stay cool. One of these days this war is going to end, and it would be awesome if Mox News could be there to celebrate that day with you.